Friends, colleagues, students, visitors, welcome to this very special lecture by John Lynn and Joshua Bolchover titled Rural-Urban Framework, New Contexts. My name's Julie Willis. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning in the Melbourne School of Design here at the University of Melbourne. I begin this evening's proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders and families both past and present. This is our first lecture in the Dean's Lecture Series for 2018, and it's a real pleasure to host Associate Professors John Lynn and Joshua Bolchover from the University of Hong Kong here at the University of Melbourne. Tonight's lecture is presented in association with Creative Victoria as a partners for the Business of Design Week, Hong Kong 2018. Bolchover and Lynn set up Rural Urban Framework, RUF, as a design and research lab at the University of Hong Kong. Over the past 10 years, RUF has focused on sites impacted by the dynamics between urban and rural transformation. Currently, they're working on two very contradictory contexts: the impact of urbanisation in rural China and the impact of rural nomads settling in the city of Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. RUF projects include schools, community centres, hospitals and village houses, amongst others. As a result of active engagement with the end users, that is, people living in community, RUF has been able to research links between social, economic, political processes and the physical transformation of each village. RUF has received numerous international awards, including the 2016 RIBA Award for International Excellence and the International Emerging Architect Award, the 2015 Curry Stone Design Prize, and the Ralph Erskine 100 Years Anniversary Award in 2014, given for innovation in architecture that primarily benefits the less privileged in society. Contributing to the global body of work exploring, documenting and challenging the urbanisation of our countrysides, Lynn and Bolchover's publications include Border Ecologies, Hong Kong's Mainland Frontier, Designing the Rural, a Global Countryside in Flux, Rural-Urban Framework, Transforming the Chinese Countryside, and Homecoming, Materialising, Contextualising and Practising the Rural in China. Bolchover and Lynn have also exhibited at the Venice Biennale, the Design Museum in London, the Chicago Biennale and the Guggenheim in New York City, among others. We are fortunate to have their work exhibiting here in our Dulux Gallery upstairs until this Friday, 11th of May. So please join me in a warm welcome for our guests, John Lynn and Joshua Bolchover.
In case you couldn't guess, this is Joshua. I'm John Lynn. I'm rural, he's urban. Speaking of context, I mean, Josh is from an island. I'm from an island. We're here on an island. On my island, they say that if there's a rule, then you can break it. I don't know if it applies here, but I had a pretty contextual experience just now when I went to the toilet, and I found this. I was in China again. Here was a squat toilet. I thought that was really interesting. Okay. I want to talk about the talk today about context, I think describes an attitude towards design, which is about a kind of reading of the context as a means to develop a design strategy. And also, furthermore, to do projects in specific contexts as a means to understand the context further, as a form of research. So our practice is based in the university. We're very much interested in the relationship between research and design, but not just research in order to do design, design as a means to do research. And we'll discuss that in a minute. So for the last, I guess, 12 years, since 2006, we've been working in primarily rural territories. And we consider ourselves urban architects. For us, the rural is really the front lines of the urbanization process. So we're interested in the sort of extreme process of urbanization, primarily occurring in China and Mongolia. We're interested in how we can develop design strategies to address these large-scale forces. And we're not interested, perhaps, in becoming rural architects. Our rural is very different from, perhaps, if we go back to 1964 Rudolphsky, you could say that there was also in this exhibition, this seminal exhibition by Rudolfsky, an idea of bringing the rural to the urban, an idea of perhaps presenting architects who were primarily working in the cities with an understanding of, traditional architecture, primary rural architecture. I mean, what did this mean? What did our previous concept of the rural mean? It meant that architecture really served to facilitate livelihood. It became the landscape. Architecture blended with the landscape. It literally was the landscape. It took advantage of natural materials. And not just natural materials, but this, one of my favorite pages about Pakistan, it took advantage of natural forces. So the wind always comes from one direction. It's very hot in the city. And every house has a wind catcher. This is not an image from the book. But I think this image, for me, really describes some of the ethos from which we work. Working in the rural, a traditional relationship between architecture and people in the village means that people work together to build architecture. So architecture's significance is not just the building itself, but the process of building. This idea that the process of making architecture actually knits a community together. We're very interested in that process and engaging this process today. One of the pages in the book is a very famous image about China. And this happens in northwestern China. This is in Henan, I believe. And it's a marriage. It's a marriage of a kind of cultural idea of courtyard living, taking advantage of available materials, which is essentially nothing much more than earth, the Los Plain. And so this idea of the kind of perfect integration between the cultural aspect, the material aspect, and the sense of livelihood. If we go back today, this is what we find. And it's no longer the story of harmony and integration. These have become the sites for our projects. There's a conflict between two forms of livelihood, the village, which essentially works and leases their land or works in industry as a factory, developing their own factories, versus agriculture, a kind of traditional form of livelihood, conflict between building above ground, buildings below ground. But if we look closer, I think what's surprising is the kind of adaptations that are occurring. So this family, when we began to ask around, they actually live in the above ground house during the spring and in the fall. And in the winter and the summer, they actually move back below ground. So there's this kind of seasonal adaptation towards trying to take advantage and combine the best of the traditional and the best of the sort of modern way of life. So their program, essentially, their house is really a house that occurs both above ground and below ground. Other places, like in Guangdong province, you see collisions between infrastructure and landscape, collisions between a traditional form of living and modern forms of living, of housing. They are also adapting their house. In this form of living, which is called the way house, literally wall, individual families which live in different sections have adapted their own house. They've sort of grown their house, they've added to it, they've changed it. And then in this one, they've done this collectively, essentially turning the interior into a large, plugging in a large apartment block into this. Elsewhere, the literal context for these traditional forms of building are also transforming, changing. This is the tulo in eastern China. And the tulos were built primarily for defense. But because of this need for defense, because of building this kind of large earthen wall, they've developed different community programs in this collective void space. Some are marketplaces, some have become schools, some are just collective areas for rearing animal, livestock, agriculture. Well, suddenly, their surroundings have become more urbanized and more dense, and they've changed, you could say that in this contextual transformation, suddenly the void space takes on a different, potentially a different meaning. It becomes potentially the only public space in this extremely urban situation. If we look now a little bit closer at what's happening inside, there's also kind of social transformation. I don't know if you know this, but people essentially live in a vertical stack in the Tulo. So a family will have the first, second, and third floor. And in a sense, it's an extremely urban housing typology in the rural. But because everybody wants their own toilet and kitchen, they start to subdivide this collective space. And the space eventually gets filled up with everyone's sort of everyone's little pie piece of their toilet and their kitchen. So the sort of collective interest has given way to the individual interest. And this is one of the biggest transformations in the rural. It's an idea of collectivity that exists primarily in traditional villages, being confronted with individual interests, individual economies. It's a collision between a traditional way of living and a modern way of living, between a traditional way of building and a modern way of building. And we very much like to see ourselves as architects in relation to this context, the role of the architect, potentially to not necessarily innovate, but to come back within this space that is created, within this collision, and begin to act, potentially to evolve the traditional towards the modern. A collision of rural and urban that is not just a physical collision, but really it's a meeting of political and economic systems. So the question we ask ourselves is, how do we engage these contradictions, these paradoxes through design? And with the big questions being posed, I'd like to hand it over to Josh.
That was a great introduction. I've never heard that before, so it was very enlightening. So,
thank you.
But I think it was a very important moment when the kind of discourse that we started, when we started working, was really about Chinese urbanization. Everyone was focusing on the city, and I think we were compelled to begin to look at that other 50% and to really try and understand what was taking place within the rural territory. And the rural for us, as John really clearly described, it wasn't for us a source of finding a kind of collective identity. It wasn't about finding a language. It was really looking at how these processes of urbanization began to touch the ground, how they begin to inscribe the earth. And it was full of contradictions, as John said. The territory that we're exploring, we saw factories against banana plantations. We saw dried up fish ponds next to high-rise new suburban development. So it's full of these kind of spatial contradictions that we wanted to try and understand, the processes that were going on. Yeah. And a key one is really in the urbanization process was infrastructure. The infrastructure was the kind of key tool that began to link the urban with the rural. It was a way that the urban processes were kind of projected onto the rural territory. So all across China, we'd see images like this, vast highways, conduits that would begin to cut across rural landscapes and begin to cut across these villages. And of course, that allows this as a kind of conduit. It was able to connect raw materials to production and consumption centers, but also able many migrant laborers to connect the rural villages to places of work. And we wanted to say, well, if this urbanization process through infrastructure is really a means to project capital into those villages, we wanted to see what's being left out of this process. So what is the downsides in this huge construction of infrastructure? And we began to look at villages like this in Lingzi Di, where the whole river valley had been bisected. There had been huge amounts of transformation, concrete structures being built, which damaged a kind of fragile watershed. And a huge amount of flooding took place in this village and actually destroyed these local micro-infrastructures, the local small bridges. And these nodes for the villagers were very important, of course, because they connected their livelihood to the market. So we were approached by a charity, an NGO, who said, well, how can you begin to stitch these villages back together? How can you recreate these nodes? How can you connect their orchards back to the market? And we came up with a series of prototypes for a series of bridges which could adapt, change according to the site locations, which could be deployed across this river valley. And our interest was really in the surplus. It wasn't just about the connection, but it was about adding additional program. We saw the bridge not just as a node that was facilitating that micro connection, but also as a social space, a place where people could meet and gather, fish, wash their clothes, whatever, but adding an additional program that would begin to create a new kind of node or new kind of hub within that village. You can see that high contrast between our small intervention, tactical insertion, versus the kind of high-speed rail going above. A similar project was here in Mulan, where the creation of this high-speed rail at the back of a site involved this huge cut, this incision in the earth, which created this huge mountain of kind of loose earth at the back of the site. And although this new piece of infrastructure, of course, connected the local town Huaji, which stimulated a huge amount of growth in that place, in that village, in the smaller village which we were working, it had very little. People carried on as if it was in the Mao era. And this mound of earth we saw as an opportunity, in a way. What could we do with that earth to do something for the site? So it was a school building, and we used the earth to create a kind of new retaining wall. A new retaining wall for a toilet, which also became a kind of reed bed filtration system. So we're always looking for opportunities to see things that are being left out within that urbanization process, or things that have been created in that process to use it as a stimulus for our design. And this reed bed then worked around and created a series of educational spaces, open spaces, new types of models for teaching within the kind of campus of the village. And it's, again, this high contrast between this new infrastructural creation of this high-speed rail and the kind of village structure itself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, today the high-speed rail runs right behind a new ecological infrastructure, kind of reed bed infrastructure. So, I mean, we have very simple design strategies. I mean, this one is really our belief in adding value through design. So essentially, there was government funding for that retaining wall. And we approached the donor, and we added to that funding in order to develop these other spaces, this kind of social and community space for the villagers. Now, another paradox, which occurs not just in China, but all over the developing world, is the fact that people are migrating away from villages for work. So as people leave towards the cities and they begin to make money in the cities, they still send a lot of the money back to the village, and they deposit it into building houses. Except what happens is, in a very ironic way, more and more people that leave, the more money is sent back. The more money is sent back, the more architecture is built. And so you have a village in which the population is essentially emptying out. There are fewer and fewer people around, and there's a building boom. The public space is being consumed. You have densities which are greater than in most cities. It's completely unregulated. In our very first project in 2006, we began to address this issue. We built a primary school. At the time, it was very much the policy to build lots of small hope schools, 希望小学, these small primary schools far out in the rural areas. And a charity basically approached us, and they had built about 100 of them. And they wanted to find a new way, because they were building the same school, the same prototype in mountainous areas in the far east and west, south or north. always the same. So we started to consider what could the school give, not to the students, but to the entire community and to the village. These days, the school is the only public space that the entire village, when they come back for New Year's or weddings and funerals, they can gather in this sort of public space. The covered seats, it creates a covered walkway, and the other side basically faces the farmland. So the school itself is cut into a rice terrace. It takes its shape as a kind of cut and fill, and it bridges essentially the sort of old economy, the agricultural economy, and this sort of new growing economy. And I must say that Rural Urban Framework really began with this project. I was already beginning with the first project of the school. And in order to get to the school, we had to travel about, I think, 8 hours from Hong Kong to get to that site at the time. And that journey went from Hong Kong through Shenzhen, through Zhaotong, through Qingmou, Dongguan. Yeah, so there was lots of sort of rural-urban territories. And having met Josh, he seemed like he was maybe thinking about a lot of things that I wasn't necessarily thinking about. We went on this journey together, and you know, Josh had curated the Manchester part of Shrinking Cities, and we began a conversation. So Rural Urban Framework was really beginning as a conversation about you know, this sort of landscape of contradiction that we found. But it also began with the second project, which was the old school. And we began to develop the old school. This was the old school building with a charity. So with the second project, we developed a program in conjunction with a charity. And the village became essentially the project. It wasn't no longer a singular building. That very much has carried on throughout our work, thinking about the village as a client, or the client as a community of people, and working very collaboratively, not just to develop the sort of hardware of architecture, but to develop sort of programs bottom up. So today, this woman, Lucy Tsai, she runs a series of workshops. It's still about education. They have Kaldori Farms, which is teaching from Hong Kong, a charity, that is teaching essentially the villagers new organic farming techniques to raise the value of their produce.
Yeah, so they were trying all different types of chickens. There was a special black chicken, which was apparently twice as valuable as your regular chicken. So they were experimenting with all these ways to try and find a new economic driver for the village itself. So it took us ages, that project, even though it was like our tiniest project.
I remember we had to leave very early because if we didn't get there before noon, then the contractor would be drunk.
Yeah.
And the first time it was great. He was a terrible, he agreed to everything. And then we came back the second time, and we realized there was a pattern going on.
Well, nothing had been done, right? Yeah. So nothing had changed.
He didn't remember our conversation at all.
Right,
yeah.
right. But it was a very piecemeal project, actually. We were trying to find little pockets of money to build the simplest things. It was the tiniest budget, I think, that we've ever had. But it was really trying to work with numerous stakeholders, including the village, in order to create this sort of gradual transformation of the village itself.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things when we describe it as research is that essentially if you think back about 40, 50 years ago, before the sort of mass development of China, all the villages were essentially the same. You know, the sort of traditional architecture was essentially the same. It fit perfectly with its livelihood. And suddenly, as urbanization occurred and money got sent back, it's almost like a perfect laboratory in which all these villages, which functioned exactly the same way, became factory villages, became suburban villages. Some began to convert directly into high-rises. So we have extremely different. Some have become theme parks. And this still continues to happen. So by tracing these differences back, we're really trying to get an understanding of the urbanization process.
Yeah, and I think what's shifted now, of course, in China, we have these 5-year consequential planning policies. And what we've noticed now is there's a new focus on healthcare and social services within the rural. Because, of course, at the beginning, there was a push for economic reform, there was a push for urban reform, and now there's a new consciousness to begin to change the social and the welfare services in rural areas. And what's interesting for us that actually in the Mao era, rural healthcare was actually heralded by the World Health Organization as being very successful. They had a system of barefoot doctors who would run around going to the villages, making sure that healthcare was being delivered to the most remote areas. But in the urbanization process, it actually created a huge cut in this system. The system wasn't tenable anymore. Healthcare was delivered through urban areas. All the doctors actually migrated to the city. They had better salaries, and rural healthcare provision really went down into these areas. But now there's a kind of new sense of trying to address this gap. And we did this through one of our projects. And one thing we wanted to do was to create a new model hospital, a new model rural healthcare facility. And one thing, of course, you notice in any form of institution, whether it's a school or a hospital, is basically built exactly the same way. It's rubber stamped. They're all kind of concrete frames. The system of building, the system of construction, it's all concrete frame with kind of brick infill. And this was the existing hospital. It's an example of this kind of generic institutional type. And this could be a school or a hospital in China. It doesn't really matter. And in fact, we did a kind of workshop with children, asking them to draw their ideal school, primary school, and they actually drew all the same building, which basically looked like this. So what was interesting for us is like, well, you know, how do we come up with a new spatial system, new ideas for how to organize a hospital building? And this one, in a certain way, was quite straightforward. Working with this charity was interested to not only come up with a new architectural model, but a new organizational system for how healthcare could be delivered. And they wanted us to add to their existing hospital building. So we came up with a strategy of wrapping a ramp around the existing hospital building, and then we would demolish the building itself. So it was a simple idea that we built the ramp that would connect all the different floors. We figured out that the ramp, a 3-story ramp, was basically the same cost as a lift. So why not, again, use that as a chance to create a new type of public space? And of course, institutions in China are very much closed off. They're gated compounds, which goes back to the kind of historical model of the Danwei. And one thing that we're very conscious of is to try and create this kind of porosity within our buildings, opening them up so that these types of institutions can also serve that village that they're placed in. And in this context, there was a village of around 3,000. That wasn't just the drive, wasn't just to serve this village of 3,000, but it was actually to serve numerous villages, that this hospital would become a hub within the area to serve actually a population of 10,000. So in this way, it's a kind of urban, have kind of an urban move to create this kind of ramp as this new type of infrastructure connected to 2 types of public space, one on the lower level and one right up on the roof. And that those spaces would be opened up to not just the people within the hospital, but also to the villages around, and also those villages who are coming from outside to be part of this kind of new type of model for urban healthcare, rural healthcare.
So I guess the paradox of this kind of big social transformations where very much the old and the young are left. I mean, we've heard stories where one brother will stay home and take care of his other 6 brothers' children. And, you know, with this kind of extreme transformations in terms of the family and family structures, on the outside, it's becoming more and more the same. you can no longer tell if this is a kind of rural or urban situation in China. In one project, we worked in the north in Shaanxi province, and all the villagers, they live in houses 10 meters by 30 meters. And they're all slowly adapting their houses. So this was a project which we really started to involve the school, involve studios, and we held a studio in which we began to try and understand the transformations that the villagers were doing and making themselves. So it didn't look like architecture, but everything they did was absolutely necessary. It was innovative. And we began to essentially start to think about creating a design program out of this investigation. Then this was developed into a model house, a prototype courtyard house, something which was about integrating different various technologies, an improved biogas system, trombe wall, and then even a traditional idea of how cooking in the kitchen, the cooking fire, heats up the smoke which passes through the bed before exiting the roof. So a way of like heating the bedroom through the activity of cooking. It's also a very simple strategy where concrete frame and mud infill walls are combined. You know, the traditional roofs are good for runoff, but then the new buildings, the concrete buildings, they're essentially flat and they become like swimming pools above when they get clogged up. So it's an area which is very dry, but it does rain once, you know, at a specific time of the year. What we decided to do was try to bring this kind of self-resilience back to the village. And so we inverted the roof as a kind of rainwater collection system, thinking that self-resilience is really the sort of primary rural quality. And through this kind of going to the city to earn income, through the reliance on the urban, they've lost that kind of self-reliance. They've lost that balance, a historical balance between the rural and the urban. You could look at Chinese policy and Chinese history, even pre-communism, and it's always about the engagement of rural and urban ideas. This also runs through Europe. We're wondering, you know, can a new balance, can a new relationship be formed between how we define the rural and how we define the urban? 1 year ago in Guangdong province, this village looked like this. 6 months later, it looked like this. And today, it looks like this. It has a density greater than most cities, as I was talking about. And why is this? It's because at the village level is the most democratic processes in China. So you elect your village leader, and there's funding given to redesign or rebuild the entire village, perhaps as a way to mask some of the inequality of wealth that is occurring. So all the villagers must agree on the same plan and design of the village. Well, everyone just wants the biggest house on the biggest piece of land. So it's a very simple equation that comes up with these gridded plots. We tried 4 times to work with various villages. We could never really overcome this sort of politics of the sort of individual self-interest. Then in 2008, there was the Sichuan Great Earthquake. And in 2010, we were contacted by a charity, Habitat for Humanity, and they had been working with a village who had rebuilt their houses after the Great Sichuan Earthquake, and their houses had collapsed again. There were aftershocks, there was heavy rain, and there were landslides. So this was going to be the 3rd time that they had to rebuild this village. We approached the donor, Nanfeng, a developer in Hong Kong, and their idea was, you know, instead of rebuilding the houses, here was an opportunity to build better. You know, could we not develop an idea for, in a sense, a sustainable village, and also a village that was not about going back to the rural past, but trying to marry rural and urban qualities. This is the plan. It's very dense. The houses are only 3 meters apart, and it's because in this new reconstruction, they've done a series of earth stabilizing piles. So there's still a very limited piece of land for which the village can happen. We designed the rooftops to bring in more light and air. And in a surprising way, we designed the roofs to have varying degrees of planting spaces. And all the villagers decided that they wanted the maximum amount of area for planting. This surprised us, in a farming community, because ironically, they have very little land for planting their own crops. So they simply turned all the roofs into essentially a kind of individual farmland. And on the ground level, they have small workshop spaces. This village is located along a tourist route, so they're hoping to draw some of that traffic up to the village, perhaps to open up little shops. So these spaces allow for these shops to occur. It also goes in line with the new government policy in which individual villagers are able now to transform their own home into a kind of commercial activity. They could only do it collectively before, and now you can do it individually. So there's a lot of sort of adjustment of policy that we're trying to keep up with throughout the design process. This is the community center. There's a charity that's moved into the village, and the roof of the community center is used for planting. Each of the columns has a sort of drainage pipe. And he's helping the villagers develop a new fruit tree kind of economy. So this is the real heart of the project, the work that comes after the architecture. Really the project begins when the architecture is finished.
So I think the last set of projects, the China work, has really been about this investigation of how the urbanization process has impacted rural villages. And then we started in around 2014 to explore a very different context, that of Mongolia, which was the complete inverse of that situation. The problem in Ulaanbaatar is really about the impact that rural nomads are having as they move to the city. And this occurred as a consequence of the 1990 democratic revolution. Mongolia was Soviet-controlled. Up until that point, it was related to this kind of state economy, and overnight it became a free market economy and also a democracy. The discovery of huge amounts of commodities, particularly coal and copper, led to a kind of stimulus of this migration. Nomads began to give up their herds and move to the city. And when they moved to the city, they simply set up their ger, or felt tent, the traditional felt tent that's designed for that nomadic movement. Nomads maybe move around 6 times a year for going towards the pastures within the steppe. And when they come to the city, they set it up and they build a fence around their plot. Now this occurred because the government in the early part of 2000 decided that it was every Mongolian's right to own a 700 square meters plot of land. So what we have is this kind of staking out of this territory within the kind of open fringes of the city, and there's no infrastructure at all. So people just simply dig a pit latrine and set up their home.
I think what's amazing about this situation is that the sort of the ger, which is the vehicle for nomadic living, has actually accelerated an urbanization process that's unprecedented, because there's no real moving to the city is extremely easy if you're a nomad. You simply just go there. There's no furniture, there's no house.
So what you see, these areas are known as the gerdistricts. And what we became fascinated by is that they can't really be described as urban or rural, but they act as this kind of critical hinge in a way, a space of assimilation for new nomads as they move to the city. But this is what you get. This is the resultant urban form. It's a kind of extensive suburbia with zero infrastructure. And you can see that this is not far from the city. It's around 2 kilometers. And of course, the ger has always been present within the culture, within the kind of urban model of Ulaanbaatar. So you can see here the closeness, the vicinity of these gerdistricts to that of the city. And as John said, it's really about that this is the basic unit of habitation that has really, yes, exacerbated this urbanization. The city, since 1990, has grown in extent 30 times, and the population has doubled. So, in fact, there's around 2/3 of the population of Ulaanbaatar actually live within these districts. So we thought, well, how do we begin to approach this? So we started to investigate from the perspective of a couple, Orangwa and Zola, who earn around $490 per month as a joint income. Zola works in the cardboard factory, and Orangwa works in the cashmere factory. They have little money, and when they moved in 2001, they were faced with the complete difference in terms of a way of life from living in the countryside to living in an urban context. They had neighbors. They were living next to other people. They had no running water, so they have to collect their water from these things known as water kiosks, which basically function as petrol stations where you go, you pay a bit of money, and you load up with water. And there was no rubbish infrastructure collection at this point. And they had about 80% of this population use coal as their basic form of heating. And given that in the winter it gets to around -30, the levels of air pollution are some of the worst in the world. And this is this expansion of the city, expanding from the Soviet linear city along one street, and you can see the extent that begin to carpet and cover these valleys and hills, particularly in the north of the city. And Mongolia at this point, it was actually going through a boom period in around 2010. There was ideas for new plans, hundreds of new plans. The Asian Development Bank have loaned Mongolia, the government, huge amounts to begin this kind of reinvestment process. But we found that this top-down model of planning was really just not tenable in this context, particularly as you're asking each individual family to give up their land, the 700 meters squared, in exchange for a 50 meters squared apartment in these very generic blocks. And when commodity prices went down, when the coal, no one wants coal anymore, it was really the government was completely bankrupt and having to pay back huge amounts of interest on the loans that they'd already taken from the ADB. So how can we approach this notion or this attempt to address urbanization? And we thought, well, let's start with what everyone owns. Let's start with the ger itself, begin to investigate how we could begin to transform it. And we noticed that people were already beginning to adapt their gers due to this kind of new form of sedentary living. So they were adding pieces, they were adding small kitchens to deal with this kind of climate shift in the summer. They might add thresholds to their gers. So we thought, well, let's take on the ger itself. And this was Orangwa's ger, and we tried to... It's also interesting to not think of just the ger as a unit of habitation, but how do we begin to create a kind of civic space through the ger? Of course, we see that carpeting of that suburban model. It's no way to create a notion of the civic or a notion of community. And the ger, of course, it's autonomous. It has a circular form, and the life inside is very much that of a kind of private realm. So we had to begin to readdress these things. Ways of thinking about the public or the private were very different for us. There was a very different context. One particular, we learned many things. One of them was that there was no word for community in Mongolian. Another thing that we learned was that rural nomads, when they want to have sex, don't have sex in the ger. They have, when they're outside, they actually stake out, put on this kind of horse stake when they want to have sex, and they have sex in the outdoors. And the ger is a different space. It's not the most private space in the context of the kind of rural setting in the steppe. So when things get moved to the city, those kind of cultural specificities, of course, have to evolve and begin to change. And this is the type of civic space that you get left with is these leftovers, these residual spaces that people have to begin to adapt and live in. So we created a prototype, a new prototype for affordable housing. We called it the GER plugin. And the idea was, how can we create a house that was around the same price as the house that they would typically build if they had enough money, around 10,000 US dollars. But this plugin would provide all the basic infrastructures that they didn't have. So it would provide a water tank. It would provide a toilet so you wouldn't have to go outside when it's minus 40 outside. And it would try and find new types of heating systems so that the GER itself could really be thermally optimized. And we tested it out. We built the structure, and we built this as the first prototype last year for Zola and Ulaanbaatar. And the idea was not that this was just a one-off or that this was something that could be rubber-stamped across UB, but the idea was that this could actually stimulate the connection of other types of plug-in systems and a system of kind of shared infrastructure, so that people could begin to think, okay, we'll share your water tank, we'll co-invest, we'll share that water tank, we'll share that septic tank. And this would facilitate a kind of growth of an off-grid infrastructural system within this small micro-community. So it's really a kind of hybrid. It's a splice between the old and new, between the vernacular structure of the GER and our new plug-in structure. So the idea really is, how can we set up this incremental process of change, given that the kind of top-down formal models of planning are simply not going to reach some of these fringe areas within UB. So we wanted to end by discussing the project that is in the exhibition area.
Yeah. Well, I think that you could say that in the Mongolia project, the site is the GER itself. So it's sited within a very specific cultural idea, and the language of it also comes from this artifact. And recently we began a new project, which has become an interesting nightmare, I guess, scenario, which is that we were asked to develop a cultural center. So when small towns and villages, when they get big enough, the first thing they do to announce that they have arrived on the urban stage is to develop a new cultural center for themselves. We've been asked to develop one. It's the biggest project we've ever done. It's 30,000 square meters. It has a museum, an exhibition, auditorium, a library, a sports center, basically every single architectural program we've never dealt with before.
And that you always dream of as well, right? It's an ideal program for architects to be challenged by.
It was we're still dreaming. But so this became very interesting because, and the worst part of all was that there was no real site constraint. There was a site, there was nothing there. And for the very first time, we were working without context. And we struggled to deal with this issue of working in a non-contextual site. And we had to essentially transform and change how we approached this project that was completely different from how we had approached other projects. So what we've tried to present here in the exhibition, I mean, is incomplete. It's also, the buildings are not built. And we're trying to present a project which is not built. It also, I think, verifies somewhat our attitude that the process of building is really what interests us and is really what's important. It's not the sort of celebration of the building itself.
Yeah, and I think we were looking at the fabric. We were looking at what types of models would make sense in this case. And we were looking then at ways to take on this sort of the organization of certain buildings within the village to begin to help shape and attempt to address this lack of context within this kind of tabula rasa site that we got. But we were also interested in the kind of the generic, you know, given that maybe in a few years' time or in 10 years' time when our mayor leaves, what are these buildings going to be used for? You know, can we design them in a way that they're adaptable and they are robust enough that they can take on different types of programs? And this was a real challenge for us because we were, you know, designing like crazy. We were like doing libraries and exhibition centers, and you know, John was coming up with this kind of crazy stuff. And there was some point we had to say, all right, no. And it was this realization. There's mountains of models in the office, and we had to say, stop. We had to really pull back and say, well, what is important here? And this is not about, you know, this kind of overly designed celebration of these unique buildings, but it was really about a collection of buildings that address kind of typology. You know.
Yeah, and we began to go back and focus on the rural story, and we started to ask ourselves, well, there's no villages here, but how could we bring the rural back? I mean, this is a place that is announcing its urbanization, but essentially it's still surrounded by villages. It's still very, very rural in nature. And we tried and we developed a series of strategies for materials, for producing materials with the villagers, producing materials within the village to sort of tap right into that transformation of village to industry. And essentially create an industry out of the building of this project. And we had three rules, which were we wanted to design a series of materials based on three distinct qualities. I think we would say personal qualities that we admire very much. It had to be dumb. So it had to be extremely, extremely simple. Anybody could do it. Second thing is it had to be unpredictable. And every time that you did it, it was not reproducible. We wanted to develop materials which not one single one was the same as another.
It was quite fascinating.
There's a third one.
There's a third one. You always forget the third one.
The most important one.
Okay.
It had to be tolerant. So you couldn't really screw it up. You know, I think that one of the lessons that we learned throughout this process is not about how do we exert control over an architectural project, but rather how do we release control and where do we release control, and only hanging on to very specific moments of control. And I think, you know, it's maybe very different. I think it's a different dialogue about what we talk about in design studios. We're very much interested in the loss of control as a kind of reality of architecture and trying to work within this reality.
That loss of control also produces absolute variation. Right? So that creates a huge amount of variation in the individual blocks. And some of our colleagues would come to our office and look at these samples that we've made and say, well, how did you make it? You know, did you make a digital file? Did you CNC it? What did you do? And we said, well, you know, we made a box, we filled it with sand, and we poured some concrete and stick some drain pipes in it. And that literally was our process, because in that we were able to create something that was, as John said, right, dumb, tolerant, and robust. And what was the other one?
Unpredictable.
And unpredictable. Okay.
We should have timed it better.
It's pretty close.
But I think we still have.
It's better next. 1 minute to 8.
Well, I guess the last context that we could talk about is really the context of working out of the university, but the idea that we always wanted to make architecture at the periphery of the profession. And so we've leveraged different kinds of academic funding, donations together. Essentially, we don't have a single client in every project. The projects are primarily collaborative. It also means we're literally working at the periphery of the sort of urban realm. Doesn't mean we don't work in cities, but we're very conscious of working in sort of an informal urban village as opposed to the formal city. And the last belief is how very small projects can impact extremely, or can address extremely large-scale forces. And the belief that you know, it doesn't matter how much funding or how much money each project is, or how big each project is, the impact really comes from the idea of adding value, no matter how small the project and no matter how cheap the project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John and Joshua, for a most amazing presentation. It's really fabulous to see the sort of enablement that you're of people and places in a completely different way, a new way, a different way of thinking about what architecture can do, with some very beautiful results. So it's really fascinating to see, and thank you very much for your insight into your very embedded practice, so we really appreciate it. Finally, thank you to all our guests for joining us for the first Dean's Lecture for the year. We do hope to see you at upcoming Dean's Lectures and other events. Please check the MSD website for more details. But finally, thank you again very much to John and Joshua for a fabulous presentation.
Congratulations.